So I think if we maybe all just start by taking our seat. So really settling in to where we are right now. Noticing our feet on the floor. The connection with the chair. Maybe the backs of the legs on the chair. Buttocks. Just tuning into our posture as we arrive in this space together. Noticing any afternoon slump. And being kind and playful with any adjustments we may want to make. I'm noticing too this sense of temperature across the body right now. Any sense of warmth, coolness. So really noticing the weight of the body going down and also the height of the body going up. And then inviting you, if you'd like to, just to bring your attention to your breath. So without me telling you where to place your attention, maybe just choosing to connect with the breath wherever you feel it most vividly right now. Noticing the in-breath and the out-breath. Just connecting. Noticing any busyness of the mind. Whenever that happens, no matter how experienced we are, how much we've practiced, remembering that it is part of the practice. So noticing any responses to the wandering and then gently guiding ourselves back to just being here right now with this in-breath and this out-breath. And practicing together in silence for the last minute or so. And then whenever you're ready, maybe just dropping your attention back down to the feet, connecting to the earth. I'm really noticing that connection, the soles of the feet, the floor, to planet Earth, the reason we're all here today. And in your own time, just ending this practice, by opening your eyes if they're closed. Having a bit of a stretch if you'd like to.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Dear colleagues, as a EAMBA Exchange of our team, there's Eugenio Correnti, and there's Teresa Ranieri from France, Portugal, and myself representing Belgium. And today we are very honored to welcome two special colleagues, Ruth Ormston from the Mindfulness Initiative UK and Thomas Legrand from Politics of Being. Before this meeting, Eugenio and I exchanged that we are both very excited and extremely looking forward to this. And for me personally, this has been inspired by reading the report on Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out, and on reading the book, Politics of Being, Wisdom and Science, Making the Bridge Between the Two. And I know the way I read them, I have to read them 3 or 4 times more, and I will still discover many things. So much gratitude to you, Thomas, for being here, and for you, Ruth, for being here, and for demonstrating that agility that you stepped up at 1 o'clock today. And sending well wishes to Jamie Bristow, who was originally scheduled for this meeting and who is ill with COVID. We will have about half of the time to listen to the insights that you gained at the Mindfulness Initiative and published in the report on Reconnection, and that you published, Thomas, in Politics of Being. And then 50% of the time devoted to interaction. Of course, it doesn't mean that you can't raise your voice in between, I think, but we will ask the presenter when she or he starts. But we know that we will have time to interact. So the conventional thing is that this starts with the biographies of the presenters. When we were preparing, Eugenio and I, we thought those biographies are so impressive and so long, we would need more time. And also the people who are here, in the invitation, you have received the links to the bios and to the Mindfulness Initiative, to the report, to Politics of Being. So we want to honor that you probably clicked on the links and only share this. You both, Ruth, representing Mindfulness Initiative, and you, Thomas, are putting your energy, your talents, your competence, and even your life in the service to the world, of helping us understand that we are missing a point. And the point we are missing is that we are not helpless. We can do something. And if we do the things that we can do, we are powerful. We are also powerful because we teach exactly the kind of teachable inner competence that in the report on Reconnection is mentioned as crucial: mindfulness and compassion. The 2 publications that you bring to the table, Ruth and Thomas, they have many interlinkages, and they show your eloquence, they show your understanding, and they show your open mind. So with this being said, we are looking forward for you to help us understand what we as individual teachers of mindfulness and compassion, and on top of that, as a community of these teachers, EAMBA all over Europe in 27 countries, could do to implement the recommendations that you have published, and especially what I call box 13 in your book, Thomas, where you describe what we could do and how we could contribute. And with this, allow me to give the word to you, Ruth, and present whatever you want to present, with the focus on what can we as teachers bring to the table, what can we do to become ambassadors of the mission that you and Thomas are bringing us and have communicated so eloquently.
Thank you so much, Katerina. I'm just going to share my screen with everybody. So please let me know if you can see the slides. Does that work for everybody? Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting Jamie and getting me, I'm afraid. My name's Ruth Ormston, as Katerina said, and I'm co-director of the Mindfulness Initiative. And it's an absolute honour to be here. And I really hope that I can do the report that Jamie, Rosie and Christine have written justice, because it's a real tour de force. And I'm going to run through it now for a few minutes. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I may not kind of turn my mind to the chat while we're going, but I'm very happy to come back to things. So if you want to ask something while it's present in your mind, please feel free to do that. I'm fully aware that most of you probably know who the Mindfulness Initiative is, but some of you might not. So I thought it'd be really useful for me just to give a real brief overview of who we are and where we started. So the Mindfulness Initiative grew out of a teaching programme in the UK Parliament for politicians who went through an 8-week course initially put on by Oxford Mindfulness Centre. There were over 200 parliamentarians that have gone through it. And out of that, there was a group of politicians that had a particular interest in mindfulness and public policy and thought there is more in this and we want to see how it could be useful in areas of public policy. And so an all-party parliamentary group was formed. And they, with us, produced something called Mindfulness UK, which was a report in 2015 that looked at the evidence base for mindfulness across 4 different sectors. So the workplace, education, criminal justice, and health, and made recommendations in respect of all 4 areas. And we continue to work on those areas and on specific policy concerns. But as well as that, we also kind of took a step back and said, you know, it's not just about having specific fixes to specific problems here. When we look at mindfulness and compassion, actually we need to expand out and look at how these are actually foundational capacities that might be helpful and indeed fundamental to helping us address some of the most complex, urgent and entrenched societal issues of our times, such as polarization, digital distraction, and in our most recent report, the climate crisis. So in spring of this year, we published Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out, in partnership with Lund University Centre for Sustainable Studies. And it's co-authored by Rosie Bell and Professor Christine Wamser, who's an expert in this field. And in the report, we basically look at the impact that mindfulness and compassion could have on both our approach to and our response to the climate crisis. So both of those things. So it's not just looking at solutions, it's also looking at how we might use mindfulness and compassion to respond to the crisis that has actually already occurred and is already here. You know, we're not kind of saying that it's something that's completely preventable and nothing's happened already. And the science on climate change is now pretty unequivocal. We know that it exists. We know that the crisis is developing at a faster pace than we're addressing it. We seem to have the technical and the economic intelligence to solve it, but that's just not happening. And so there must be a missing piece to the puzzle. And we're aware that there are going to need to be large physical, external, technical changes that need to take place in order to respond to the crisis. But we felt that the missing piece was actually the internal solution that will support that to actually come into fruition. So our inner capacities, maybe the climate crisis actually starts from within, and if we address it from our heart, from our minds, and from our culture, then we have more of a chance of actually coming up with these technical solutions in a way that is more effective and long-term and sustainable. And this realization seems to have taken place at the very top of global governance. So we have here a quote from Christiana Figueres, who's former executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And she said, there are many changes to make over the next 10 years, and each of us will take different steps along the way, but all of us start the transformation in one place, our mindset. And interestingly, the Intergovernmental Planning on Climate Change, IPPC, have started to reference for the first time the role of inner transitions towards sustainability. So there is this kind of growing recognition of the fact that inner development and our inner capacities have a key role to play when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. So as part of the research for this report, Jamie and Christine interviewed over 25 politicians, consulted with a number of leading sustainability experts, and the outcome for them seemed to be that there was something missing in terms of our minds and climate change. And in putting together the results of those interviews, I just wanted to kind of show you some of the findings on how the politicians were viewing the connection between mind and climate. So firstly, politicians talked about the fact that our minds are victims of the impact of climate change. So eco-anxiety was something that clearly came out as a theme. There's particular concern for the young and how we address eco-anxiety amongst the young. Secondly, the mind was described as actually being a driver of climate change. So we tend to think of the climate crisis as a technical problem, but actually there are many qualities of mind that drive or sustain behaviour that contributes directly to and exacerbates the climate crisis. Thirdly, some politicians talked about the mind being a barrier to action. So through climate change denial, or through our own biases, burying our heads in the sand, we actually don't take any action, and that's a problem. And finally, there were policymakers and politicians who really saw the vicious cycle that there is between all of these things. So the fact that the mind can be a driver of climate change, and then worries about the climate crisis can exacerbate poor mental health, and that in turn can lead to unsustainable behaviours which contribute further to the climate crisis. So the fact that we can get into this vicious loop where actually we're not resolving anything because we're just going from kind of things that exacerbate the crisis round to things that further exacerbate it. And in the interviews with politicians and policymakers, when talking about the climate crisis and the role of inner capacities, a key thread that seemed to emerge or come out was the fact that this is really a crisis of relationship. So the climate crisis is a crisis of a relationship that we have with ourselves, that we have with each other, and that we have with the planet. And where there's a disconnect between any of those three parts of a whole, we have a problem, because we need all of them to be connected for the planet to thrive, flourish, and indeed survive. And I've put on here a quote from Alvina Armeister, member of the European Parliament, serving on the Committee of Foreign Affairs. And she said, I don't just use mindfulness to manage stress, but to create a connection within this work to something deeper. I think of mindfulness as something that connects me with the web of life on our planet, that could reconnect us all, something that could help the planet prosper, not financially, but in terms of abundance for all living things. For me, it's about deep connection. And so the narrative that we felt worked best to tie together all of the things that we wanted to say on mindfulness and compassion and the contribution that they could make to the climate crisis in a positive way really fell under this theme of connection and reconnection. So we talk about it as a story of reconnecting, something that's urgently needed if we're going to meet the challenges that the climate crisis presents. If we're going to want and co-create and negotiate and implement all of the solutions that we need, we have to look at why we're so disconnected and then look at ways in which we can reconnect. And the good news is that as human beings, we possess all these capacities for connection. So with ourselves and with others and the world, it's not something that, you know, we don't have. It's just these have been underdeveloped, hijacked, deprioritized in the way that many of us live our lives. But for me, the active hope in all of this is that we can get those back, and we can foster and we can nurture and we can nourish them in a way that can have really positive results. So for the next part of the talk, and it won't be long, I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the report. So if you haven't read it, you kind of can get a bit of an idea of what it's about. But I really would urge you to go to our website and download it for free, and really read through it a couple of times, as Katerina said. So we divide the report into two sections, and chapter 1 covers the fundamentals of connection and how these can be fostered and amplified by mindfulness and compassion. And then chapter 2 looks at, in a bit more detail, why those elements of connection are so important when it comes to addressing the climate change on a practical level, and the role that mindfulness and compassion have to play there. So in chapter 1, we focus on what we call here the fundamentals of connection, and artificially, to some extent, for the purposes of the report and how we wanted to be able to highlight the evidence base and bring certain points out, we break this down into mind, body and heart. But we recognise at the outset that all of these faculties are clearly not separate, and they're part of an integrated whole. And when it comes to the mind, we explore attention, receptivity and perspective taking. So essentially those key ways in which we do connect with the world around us. And we discuss how innate biases, our susceptibility to distraction can disrupt that connection, and the role the digital economy can play in that, in both exacerbating our biases and distracting our attention, potentially narrowing our perspective and constricting our ability to have that cognitive flexibility. And then we look at how mindfulness can actually free us from some of those hijacks and restrictions. And by cultivating, through mindfulness and compassion, qualities like allowing, like care, like curiosity, we can open ourselves up to new information, we can take on different perspectives, and importantly, we can stand more of a chance of keeping our attention where we actually want it to be, which is incredibly important with the climate crisis, because it's, you know, it's a crisis that is slow but always there. So it's something that we need to constantly be bringing our attention and our minds back to again and again. And then turning to the body, we argue that a culture which devalues or neglects the body, I guess, is reflected in disconnection from the living world. And ultimately that can show up in unsustainable behaviours. So we note that a tendency to disregard what our bodies have to tell us limits our understanding as we're trying to tackle these fundamental challenges. And mindfulness can help us to reconnect to our bodily intelligence, giving us important messages about what we need to do. And we talk about the body's tendency to close, shut down, how we can have maladaptive responses to threat and trauma, and that can increase unsustainable behaviour and drive social fragmentation and further limit our capacity to respond to the climate crisis. And the fact that mindfulness and compassion can enable us to reconnect and help us to recognise and regulate some of those triggers, overcome social barriers, and allow us to act collectively in the face of these shared challenges. And last but of course by no means least, we talk about the domain of the heart, and we discuss the human feelings and qualities that have evolved to help us connect with each other. We look at the importance of humans' capacities for compassion, empathy and emotional intelligence. And we really argue that rather than these just being, you know, soft skills, nice to have, these are actually fundamental to being active, empowering, and to helping our individual and collective well-being come into play. So we need to activate, nourish, grow these fundamental skills if we're going to connect emotionally with the impact of our cultures and lifestyles on the planet. So that's absolutely vital when it comes to climate action. We liked this quote from Tom Rivett-Carnac, who was a political lobbyist for the UNFCCC, very involved in the Paris COP. And he says, compassion has an enormously practical application in the world. It is an entry point to action on all types of social and environmental issues. So turning to chapter 2, having established these 3 fundamentals of connection, we look at specific ways in which mindful and compassionate reconnection matter in the context of climate action. So in the section on staying with the trouble, we ask, how do we engage with the painful reality of climate change, where our tendency or our habitual reaction might be to ignore this urgent but slow crisis, bury our heads in the sand, turn away, or shut down to avoid discomfort it brings. Because if overwhelm is accompanied by disengagement, that in turn leads to disconnection, and we're back where we started. So here, compassion and mindfulness are profoundly valuable in helping us turn towards difficult experiences. We all have experience of this as mindfulness teachers, you know, turning towards the difficult, processing the emotional impact of things that we're finding a challenge. And because mindfulness encourages to explore and be curious, but with care around that distress, it can help us locate the source, both internally and externally, and then it can empower us to actually do something about it, rather than us just feeling as though we've frozen because we're just overwhelmed. And increasingly, there are new social mindfulness interventions that are becoming important in plugging that inner inquiry into the wider world and helping us create change. And finally, in this chapter, we also look at the way mental health impacts of the climate crisis can drive unsustainable behaviour, form barriers to taking effective action. And we show how mindfulness and compassion can help us cultivate resilience and positive emotion, so turning that vicious cycle into a more positive spiral of individual and then planetary well-being. And this quote is from Caroline Lucas, who is a British MP and former leader of the Green Party in the UK. And she says, mindfulness has the potential not only to inspire us to protect the natural world, but also to equip us with the strength that we undoubtedly need to confront the true scale of the environmental crisis we face. So it's really important that we actually look at mindfulness and compassion as being resources as well as, you know, kind of enablers within this report. And having looked at what it's needed to stay engaged with the crisis, we then look at how we might start to view it differently. So we trace the roots of the climate crisis back to this idea of separateness and disconnection. And we look at the ways at which mindfulness can help us examine our belief systems, nurture a way of looking at the world in a different way, seeing it as interconnected, and seeing ourselves and the other people as an intrinsic part of this whole, this bigger whole that is the planet. So we discuss in this context the effect of mindfulness and compassion on reducing polarization. And we also look at the effect of mindfulness and compassion on increasing the sense of nature connection or identification with nature, and how that's so needed to transform behaviour towards sustainability. And I think nature connection is one of those themes that is just coming out much more generally in terms of what I'm listening to, what I'm hearing, discussions that I'm going to with policymakers. So plugging mindfulness and compassion into that is really important, and it's a really useful way of talking about some of this. And finally, we look at how we actually take appropriate action, because it's possible to see and feel all of this connection with the world, but still have factors disrupting us actually doing anything about it. And that's partly evolutionary. So the report discusses the fact that we're programmed to prioritise short-term satisfaction over long-term abstract goals, like the well-being of the world. And it's also baked into and reinforced by our surrounding industrial ecosystems. So we have a consumer culture that sort of disconnects us from a realistic sense of what we actually need, what others need, and what the world needs. Sustainability scholars talk about this sometimes as a values action gap, which can be a huge problem in the context of climate change and addressing it. So we argue that mindfulness and compassion can help us reattune our focus towards qualities like appreciation and care. So reducing that goal-driven tendency to just reach for more and more and more. And it can also help us notice our impulsive automatic behaviours and help us to escape from some of those patterns that may be digitally manipulated or consumer manipulated, and reconnect to our true ethical intentions and what we really want to be doing and how we want to be living our lives. And finally, we have some policy recommendations in the back of the report. So I'd recommend reading the recommendations and taking a look at what we say, because we break it down into different areas and really kind of give a sort of overview recommendation, but then drill down into detail and what that might actually be. And I was asked, to reflect on what specifically and intentionally mindfulness teachers can do in this space. So what can we do? Because I don't know about you, but sometimes when you look at this stuff, it can feel overwhelming and you can think, I just don't know where to start. And how do I talk about this with other people? And what I would say is that although we refer to this as a policy report, Jamie, Rosie and Christine have just so skillfully given us the language to be able to start talking about this in a useful way. So if you don't do anything, look at the report. And I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think it is really important that we actually have some language that doesn't come across as just fluffy, vague, doesn't really say anything. This really kind of gives you lots of hooks on which to have conversations with people. So how can we actually practically apply this to something as tangible as the climate crisis? So getting familiar with the report, but also all the other work that's out there, just listening, learning, absorbing and talking to people. I asked Caroline Lucas when we were launching this report, what can policymakers do? What can we do with this? And one of the things that really resonated with me was she said, we need to connect with people. You need to go out for coffee with 10 people, talk to them about this report, talk to them about what it means, get everybody thinking about it, everybody talking about it, and everybody thinking about how our inner development is actually important, so that we get to the point where, a few years ago, people found talking about mindfulness strange. We want it to, and now it's kind of, pretty common parlance. We want it to be common parlance that your inner development is actually essential to tackling the climate crisis. And why wouldn't we be talking about it? Not why are we talking about it? So yeah, that was my first thought in terms of practical application. I did write down be curious, but then I sort of thought about, be curious in quite a practical way in terms of seeking out some of the information that there is on this. I think I wrote that partly because my friend who is not into mindfulness said that she nearly hung up on a Zoom call when she was told to be curious about conflict. So I wanted to give a bit more detail on be curious. And from a teaching perspective in particular, I think stay close to what developments there are going to be in the mindfulness curriculum around this, because in the Reconnection report, we talk about the Inner Green Deal, which is just one particular case study on a mindfulness-based curriculum that is looking at sustainability. And I think there's going to be more and more coming out on this. So really paying attention to what there is, seeing how it's done in a way that's linking in with good practice guidelines, making sure there's an integrity base and people are being walked through some of this stuff with care, because, it is difficult, and for some people it might not be the right time for them to visit some of this stuff. So I think following what's happening in the mindfulness sector and the mindfulness teaching world is really, really essential. And the final thing that I thought from a practical perspective, which is not the final thing because it's the least important, is probably the most important, and that is resourcing yourself to stay curious and to do this work, and doing that through practice. But also a really practical way of doing that is to have this connection with nature, and connecting with nature in a mindful way. So we talk in the report about this a lot, but not just going out into nature with your mobile phone and checking your WhatsApp, but really establishing a deep connection with nature. And I think that's also a way in which you can access and talk about this with some people for whom it might be quite new, and who might not be quite as far ahead in the journey as you are. Nature is something that we should all have access to. We don't have as much access in some cases as we should. But I think it's a way that we can gently introduce this topic to people. And, most of the research that kind of shows that if nature improves our mental health, and improvements in our mental health lead to more sustainable behaviours, then for me, that's just a win-win situation. And I'm going to end, I'm going to steal a quote that Caroline Lucas used in our launch, which I just loved. And it's a quote from US author Richard Louv from his book Last Child in the Woods. And it's really reflecting on this connection with nature. And he said, "We won't protect what we don't love. We won't love what we don't know. And we can't know what we don't see or touch or hear." And Caroline Lucas added, "or mindfully experience," to the end of that quote. So it's been adapted. So I'm passing on the adapted version. But that's everything from me, because I think I was taking slightly longer. So thank you very much for having me. And yeah, I'll pass it back over to you, Katerina.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I think, Daniel, can you take over?
Yeah, so thanks for this summary and insights of this report. And so maybe we can ask Thomas if he wants to share about his book, his work, in a simple way for us to understand. Yeah.
Sure. So thank you very much, Ruth. I've been very much following your work, and we are also working also with Jamie and the Mindfulness Initiative. That's a great report. I'm, as you may know, I'm an environmentalist myself, working really much on the climate crisis. And for the last 10 years, I've been trying to connect the insights I've gained, let's say, from my spiritual practice to my work, and how we can approach development from a wisdom perspective or spiritual perspective. And it comes from so we were talking about mindfulness and compassion as a way to deal with the climate crisis. And I would argue that this kind of inner development, I would say, is not only a resource, a strategy to deal with the crisis we're facing, but it's really true human development. So I in my work as an environmentalist, I would say, I've come to realize, how antagonistic is our current development paradigm focused on economic growth, and how deep needs to be the shift of our societies. And my conclusion is that it goes all the way to change the very objectives we assign to our lives, individually, but also collectively. And the concept of politics of being is that kind of wisdom-based approach to politics, and it builds on this sentence from the Earth Charter, which says, when basic needs have been met, development is about being more rather than having more. So that's the proposal. And in this book, I've tried to explain, why it makes sense, and also where are the seeds in science and in societies, in social change initiatives that are embodying this new development paradigm. And as you may have seen my biography, I live next to Plum Village, the monastery of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh. And I'm hearing about these seeds every day while I was working on this book and writing this book. But I also believe that these seeds are universal and are basically reflecting, what an awakened person or more advanced civilization be. And these seeds are the awareness of interconnection. I call that understanding, and we can see that in systemic thinking, complex thinking, integral thinking. The second would be life, and all the people that explains, that we should harmonize ourselves collectively with how nature works. The third one is happiness, that is again proposed as a new development paradigm also for example, by Bhutan, and in general, well-being becomes increasingly relevant for many countries, New Zealand, Nordic countries, etc. in Europe. Another one is, I call it love, but it's the science of compassion, empathy, and there are very concrete initiatives on that, like the Charter for Compassion and cities deciding to become compassionate. The other one would be peace, and or opposition to structural violence in terms of economic violence, gender, race, etc. Last one being mindfulness, that as the Mindfulness Initiative shows, how important it can be also even for specific public policies in different sectors. And the last one, I call it light, which is more like the subtle realities and how we should look more deeply into that. And in this book, based on these science, new fields of science, and social change initiatives grounded in these values, I show that we can design very concrete public policy agendas in many sectors for this politics of being, this new development paradigm. Recognizing also that all development paradigm is indeed a reflection of of our culture, let's say, and building on the work of Charles Eisenstein, showing that basically it's also this change of paradigm is about moving from the story of separation to the story of interbeing. And an important insight here is that it's important to recognize, often we are told that we need to live less well, less comfortable, just to be able to take care of nature and maybe share more and take care of the social problems that we face. And I think this is really coming from this old paradigm of separation. And I think the new story, and now the good news is that there is a lot of science that is more and more increasingly supporting that, is that on the contrary, right, the social environmental crises are also rather a reflection of a deep human crisis and suffering. And we can rather become, we can have human flourishing together with collective flourishing, and both are not, we cannot separate them, on the contrary. So I think in terms of your work, as Ruth said, the important things is that yeah, we need to build these inner capacities, and your work is instrumental for that. It can be a work at an individual level, but also, as I show in the book, it's not only about through, let's say, education or mental health, or even maybe taking care of early childhood well-being, but also we need to operate from a different mindset. So our institutions needs to be able to deal with the problems we are facing from a different perspective, from the perspective, for example, of the story of interbeing, rather than the story of separation. I give you a very concrete example. In the justice systems, we have often justice systems that are called retributive. So we see justice, that someone has done harm and needs to be punished. And we increasingly see that it's not working, and it also make all the rest of the things worse, because it strengthens this overall narrative of separation. And on the contrary, the alternative paradigm is often said to be restorative justice. And rather than tapping into our kind of natural instinct for retaliation, we can either we can have restorative process where everyone comes together and practice these human qualities of listening, of caring, of the courage, etc., while addressing the issues we need to deal with in our justice systems. And science tells us also that it indeed works much better. So we need to operate from, also address our issue from a different paradigm. Importantly, I think that's talking about this change of paradigm, we have to recognize that, as Thich Nhat Hanh often has said, mindfulness is not a tool, but it's a path. So it's not something like just Of course, now we are using this language of building inner capacities, etc., to make sense for a lot of people we are dealing with there. But I think it's important as mindfulness teachers to remember that it's not about just an instrumentalized version of mindfulness. And as I say in the book, The Politics of Being, we cannot separate the goal and the means. As I was saying, the goal of being, and as I give an example, for example, in the justice system. So we need to practice, all of our institutions should be an opportunity to practice these human qualities. So the quality of being is, there was a question, I think at the beginning was framed like, what can you do? And if I'm able to rephrase that question, just to remember that our quality of being impregnates all of our doing. So I think our first responsibility as mindfulness teacher is to cultivate this quality of being. And I know that many of us are dealing with this climate crisis and potential devastating effects for the earth and for children, etc. Often face the possibility of burnouts and mental health issues, etc. So I think it's very important to recognize that our first responsibility is to take care of ourselves and be able to offer our stability for the people that are around us, right? Rather than, for example, seeking more directly to convince them of the importance to take action. So the most important thing, I believe, is to take care of our being, and recognize also often this suffering comes from the question about, what is our impact, and are we really that meaningful what we are doing, especially when we are in front the importance of that, the magnitude of the crisis. And there I've been practicing myself recently with this insight that is very important in our Plum Village tradition, which Thich Nhat Hanh labels as go as a river. So if we want people to understand our interdependence, but also as change makers, let's say, it's very important to recognize that we are not alone, and we are part of a much larger movement, and we can't know what impacts we are, because our impact is not only direct, it can be also through ways that we can't really imagine. And I think it's important, when I've been reflecting a lot on that in the last few weeks, because I've worked 10 years on these books. I've made obviously a lot of work, a lot of hope and love in this book, and it has been sometimes a little bit overwhelming to do all what needed to be done to get this book out and now being promoting, etc. And I think it's important to and the teachings point us in that direction. What kind of mindset are we approaching our world? Is that from the story of separation, and like we feel isolated, and then it becomes very heavy to wave that, or is it really from this story of interbeing, where we could feel we're part of something much bigger, and our contribution can go through many ways? And I think on the one sense, it's easily becoming overwhelming, and we can act from a place of I don't know, it costs us, but when we act really with this insight, I think we can better act from a space of love, of service, and of joy, of being in service. And an important also insight, and I've heard that recently in Plum Village, someone saying that based on Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, that we need to work with the urgency of the present moment, but we need also to work with the freedom of eternity. And it's also linked to these two dimensions, one of the historical material dimension that, that's more linked to what we need to do in the present moment. But also when we look at the ultimate dimension, we have to recognize that, there have been a lot of, this is a sixth biodiversity extinction crisis that, when we look at through longer times, we see that these planet Earth will keep evolving, and at some point will be disappearing, right? So we can have this kind of freedom from the inside of this ultimate dimension. And finally, just maybe a final thought, because I've been in touch recently with some people really looking into how our societies may collapse in the future, and the suffering, the fear that this vision can bring. What I like to offer, linked to that work of the politics of being, is that, to me, the most important question is not about whether our societies will collapse, and even if this collapse will be mild or strong. But to me, the most important question in this century would be if we'll be able to make this cultural evolution of a spiritual nature that politics of being can nurture, whether it is before or after whatever collapse. I think we need to recognize that it's part of how life works. If you want to have something new to be born, you need a phase of destruction and death. So it's part of the process. And I think we should not see too much as a failure whatever happens in terms of our society's eventual small or larger collapse, but really be aware that this is a very deep cultural, spiritual evolution that we are called to undergo. And it has been announced in many traditions and by many spiritual teachers. And that is really, if you take a larger frame of history, that is really the challenge at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your sharing, Thomas. Maybe we can open up for questions or sharing on what Ruth and Thomas has been sharing of the Mindfulness Initiative and politics of being. Last meeting we had Satish Kumar 2 weeks back, and he's been an ecologist all his life, and we had this small talk with him before the meeting, and I think Thomas, you've met him several times, and he read your book, and he was referring a lot to Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings and this interconnectedness and this, and he was telling us teachers to have some hope. Yeah. That was the key message he gave us.
Well, it was more than hope. It was active hope.
Active hope.
John Macy's concept of not giving up, even in the dire circumstances that you might lose hope, but to stay hopeful and to act. because you know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. But I was just digesting what you said, Thomas, that you used words like undergoing, accepting this waves of rising and going down, destruction as part of creation. Yep, I need to sit on that because it's also heavy. Is that what you meant? That we accept that heaviness as well?
That we accept destruction, you mean, as part of creation? Yeah, no, I mean, what else can we do, you know, when I think acceptance does not impede, you know, action, but I think it's, you know, it's obviously, you know, it can be a process and it's not something that can be done right away, but yeah, and I think, you know, we obviously, you know, the collapse we already experiencing may affect, you know, our comfort and lives, and but I think also in, you know, the way our systems are they are rooted very deeply, you know, and that is why, you know, there is to undo them will probably have to go through it cannot be all planned, and there will probably have some cost to our well-being, and yeah, I think we need to accept that, because it's never useful to reject reality. The presentation of Ruth was pointing to our attention also. I think one thing I see often, and like people closing down or I don't know, you're saying closing up to you know, the truth of climate change. We as mindfulness practitioners, I think that's why it's also important to cultivate our well-being and our resilience, because if others see that people who look at the reality just get burned out, it's not it's not really engaging for people to step into that path, right? And one thing that is important there is that we have to recognize that our own limitations and what seeds we choose to water. Sometimes, you know, and I think we have a lot of us may have experienced that during COVID times, for example, and now maybe for the Ukraine wars, that sometimes you cannot, it's not really healthy to every day, you know, water the seeds of fear and anger, etc., by looking at the news. So we also need to decide and choose, you know, what we want to let in and what we rather choose to let out. And, you know, as Ruth was saying, you know, spend some time also in nature, for example, or with a family, or things that we like to cultivate also the seed of joy and well-being in ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that. Thank you. I also think that it relates to what you said, Ruth, on retuning focus. Because the retuning focus is something that sounds like the more constructive thing to be able to do when you've nourished your being and accepted destruction as the seeds or the compost of the new. But then retuning focus gives the energy to continue.
Yeah, for us to actually take some of the action that will, there are things that we can do. I think that's, active hope is a very important sort of part of this. And I think I'd say if you're kind of feeling despondent about it, watching Caroline Lucas, Joko Alenda and Tom Rivett-Carnac speak at our launch, these are, policymakers who are involved in this day in, day out, and you wonder how they don't get burnt out on it. Hearing them talk about how they use mindfulness and compassion to resource themselves, because you are turning towards, a darkness, the truth of climate change, but also talking about how they've used it to resource themselves to take action. And, the fact that if we do get this shift in mindset, it could be really fundamental to some of the solutions that are coming out. Tom Rivett-Carnac talked about the Paris Agreement coming out of a shift in mindset. He was like, that's what it was. It was people's kind of positivity and the way they approached it in their minds that changed things. It wasn't, some kind of technical factor. So just not kind of forgetting the importance of that, I think, is really, for me, sort of helps sustain you and keep you going in this. So yeah, I'd watch them to kind of feel feel inspired and motivated.
Thomas, I guess that when you talk about nourishing the being, then that is also close to what Ruth calls resourcing yourself, and not getting into the doing before you resource yourself, in order to, because even when we go in an airplane and something happens, we have to put on our own oxygen mask before we can help anyone else. So that's the simple image for resourcing. Is that also what you mean by the being part, nourishing our own being part?
Yeah, I think it's part of that. I define being, we can see two aspects. One is our true being, and which I believe is, and spiritual traditions have said to be, we can call it unity consciousness, or we can call it interbeing. And I've said before, how interbeing is important to have this awareness of going as a river, right? And I think also true being can refer also to the clear sense of our mission, of what we are here for. And when we can connect with clarity to our purpose, I think that can be really useful. And the other aspect of being is what I said, to be our highest being, or cultivating this kind of higher qualities, but that arise from the connection with our true being. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see a hand rising. Johannes Karamans, would you please unmute yourself and bring your comment or question, whatever it is. Welcome. You're not unmuted.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for Katrina for inviting me to this meeting. And thank you very much, Ruth and Thomas, for your comments. Very insightful. I want to make one remark. Ruth mentioned the Paris Agreement. I was there, and it was a very emotional moment. And we were all happy when finally it came all through. And in that sense, there was something that Thomas mentioned I find very insightful about the transformation, socioeconomic model, and seeing the importance of being more rather than having more. And I think it's a perfect short way of saying the direction we have to go in. And that's interesting because I was earlier today in a meeting with representatives from the Caribbean states, all islands heavily under threat from climate change as extreme weather events. And it was interesting that they mentioned, most participants, the importance of the indigenous voice, the indigenous voice. And in their case, Afro-descendants, but in other parts of Latin America where I usually work, the indigenous voice is very important. But I've noticed, and that's the interesting thing, the indigenous communities, as I'm sure Thomas also recognizes, they lay more emphasis on being more, and even mostly on the collective level, than having more. The importance is being more, and as a person, as a family, and the collectivity as a whole. And in that sense, it's interesting that in the last, let's say, for 4 or 5 years, the importance of the indigenous voice is more and more repeated on the international level and in the negotiations on climate change. So in that sense, I feel, Thomas, there is indeed a change going on. Always it's slower than we would like to see, but it's happening. And because in these negotiations, you see that the indigenous point of view is often that what we need is being more as a collectivity, but not having more. That's not the economic model that we have. So in that sense, again, there's a hopeful development. But that's, yeah, it was not a question, it's a remark. Thank you.
That's fine. This is a dialogue. It's not a question and answer session. Thank you. Thomas, do you want to respond, or shall I give the floor to Teresa? She wanted to also raise your hand.
I'm happy to say a few words because I think that's an important point Johannes just mentioned. It relates very much to my work. I would say that I think I've said politics of being as a new development paradigm is part of a process of decolonizing our mindsets, because we have to recognize that this story of separation that brought about this development paradigm focused on economic growth has come historically from the West and from specific values such as materialism, individualism, reductionism, anthropocentrism. And this development paradigm focused on economic growth have then been spread through colonization and then through globalization to the rest of the world. But it's really embedded in a specific worldview that is very detrimental to the earth right now. And indeed, indigenous people have mentioned in important international forums the importance of culture. And basically, when we apply being as a collective goal at a collective level, we are talking basically about a cultural development and the cultural evolution that we need to do right now. And this insight, and I was mentioning, the importance of the relationship with others, the relationship with nature and with ourselves for our well-being, and that is also very much emphasized, especially the relationship with others and with nature by indigenous people. I think they are very important at the moment. The starting point of the politics of being is to say, okay, when we're now facing such immense challenges, what are you supposed to do in that case? Well, I think the obvious reason, the obvious answer would be to come back to wisdom. What wisdom and wisdom traditions have to say about that, and that's the starting point to come up with this concept, as I say, of being more, which comes from the Earth Charter and have been also proposed by interreligious movements as a way to go. And just the last point is that when you look at traditional wisdoms, the ones from indigenous communities in particular, their traditional wisdom often emphasize what I call the the story of interbeing, or this interbeing nature. And you can say that very clearly in Ubuntu, for example, the traditional wisdom of Southern Africa. It is defined exactly the same way interbeing is defined. I am because you are, and you see that in many other traditional wisdoms, because that's just a way to have a healthy communities that can be resilient. You know, no community can be resilient with the individual and materialistic mindset, because often the two come together, even reductionistic. So it's really coming back to our roots, and the wisdom of indigenous people are especially important to deal with the environmental crisis, because they are really the custodians of Mother Earth.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Teresa, you have raised your hand several times. Please, excuse me for...
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I would like to allow a bridge here. So starting from Ruth, where she said that we need to change the mindset. And as mindfulness teachers, we teach from embodiment. So my internet, I think, is very unstable. So probably my voice is not, it's a bit broken.
Yeah.
But yes, so that the caring for the planet comes from that place of really embodiment of caring. So I start by myself, from myself, and so is a negotiation. What is caring for me? I don't know. Do I drink another cup of water or whatever? You know, it's in this planet is quite difficult. Can you hear me, or is it very broken?
Yes, but we can hear you.
Yeah,
it's broken.
But Thomas, you said something that was quite striking for me. You said that, and I think it's very difficult for many people to allow that change, because change, it means to renounce, and that is not a word we like. But you said that kind of mindset is also coming from separation. Could you say a bit more about that? Because it's quite, yeah, it's broken, yeah. So how abundance in that prosperity, but still, you know, it's a bit difficult. I wade through that without renouncing. So could you say, please, more about that? That is.
Okay, while we are waiting for Teresa to come back, maybe you can chime in and we answer her question. Would you please?
I'm not sure I've said that, but I think my point was I'm not sure I've said about, you know, like the renouncing to some comfort, etc. And the difficulty associated with that comes from the story of separation. Maybe the emphasis on material well-being is linked to that. So there is some of our well-being that we may renounce because of some difficulties of our societies. Probably I would say that I was offering a longer-term perspective on, you know, what is important, looking at the next generations, etc. And maybe this consciousness, this awareness of, you know, the longer historical time frame, you know, connects us with our nature or of interbeing, and we can see, we can maybe accept more easily some difficulties in our lifetime, because we know that it is part of a process, and that we will continue then through the next generations. I don't know if that's very useful. That's what I have now. Ruth, you want to?
Yeah,
question for you also.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on the embodiment, and apologies because it was breaking up a little bit, but I think I was getting the gist of what you were saying, Teresa. And we had some interesting discussions. Well, I know Jamie had some interesting discussions where we were putting together the report about whether or not, you know, we even call it mind, body, heart, because actually when we talk about the mind, that encompasses everything. So when we talk about our mindset, that has to encompass body and heart, you know, and a shift in mindset, because otherwise we wouldn't be connected to ourselves if we didn't have embodiment. So I think, you know, embodiment and the body is just as important as the mind and the heart. It's kind of, it's slightly, you know, we have to label these things to be able to talk about them, but in a way, you know, we need to be connected with ourselves through mind, body and heart before we can then connect with others and the planet. So embodiment plays an absolutely crucial part in that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, Teresa is back. Please, Stefan, you raise your hand, would you? And then Richard.
Ah, the mic, Stefan, the mic.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, my question is about as a mindfulness teacher, an MBSR teacher. I think we are lucky as mindfulness teacher because we have a consciousness development which is maybe higher than average people, and this is precisely what we teach and what we are contributing for. We are aiming at, I am aiming at develop the consciousness of the people to be more aware of the challenges of their life and the challenges of their relationships and the challenges of the planet and the climate change. So I think I'm lucky, but the other people are not as, I don't know the word in English, conscious as me, or I don't know the word, something like that. And my question is about me as a mindfulness teacher. How can I integrate all these reflections into my way to teach or into my programs, or to talk and to share with people that are not very aware of the challenges that we are facing. I'm not sure I'm very clear in my question, but the way I teach is of course impregnated of this of changes, of the challenges, but sometimes I really have some difficulties to not to convince, but simply to talk about that without having a very strong reaction and maybe some resistance about this subject, because it's at the same time really banalized and also very interrogating something, questioning something in the mind of the person. But I see that people don't go in this direction. So this is a question to explore. I don't wait for a precise answer. Am I clear?
You are, and I think that's why I said kind of exploring some of the curriculum that's starting to develop around this is quite an important role as a mindfulness teacher, because I think, you know, it's really important when we're teaching mindfulness that we meet people where they are. And in some MBSR courses, you know, the MBSR curriculum does not encompass this stuff at the moment, as far as I know, and so it might not be necessarily the right forum in which to introduce it. But there are courses that look more at social mindfulness and, you know, the sort of internal stresses, but also the external stresses, and look at them more explicitly, that may be more appropriate for this sort of stuff to come out. So yeah, that's kind of my initial take on it, to watch this space and see what's developing, because I think we have a responsibility as mindfulness teachers to really kind of do this with care. And for some people who don't have, as you were saying, Stefan, the resources and the skills, this stuff can be quite overwhelming.
Mm. Thank you.
I would say maybe also the way we approach that, maybe not so much with the intention of changing people, and but rather as also see how their suffering is linked to our collective suffering, and if they are not able to open up to some truths around climate change, for example, just take, you know, the response that they have, the barriers, that can be an object of meditation and of reflection with them, but coming from a compassionate space, rather than trying to go beyond these barriers, rather just to welcome them, to embrace them, and to invite to look what there is behind. I think the intention with which we work in general can be really make a difference. You know, if we work to change people and have our own agenda around climate change put forward, of we are simply, you know, reflecting what we know is true, but not with the intention of necessarily pushing, you know, people where they don't want necessarily to go, but rather just invite them to, you know, contemplate what this is triggering in them, and why is that, no?
And also, I think remembering the role of compassion in this as well, you know, because compassion is a way of connecting that individual suffering to, you know, when we practice self-compassion and we look at our individual suffering and then the suffering of others, and that is a way of kind of broadening out the, you know, the perspective, which is what a lot of this stuff is around. You know, it's taking this narrow perspective and broadening it out so we can open up to different ideas and kind of improve our cognitive flexibility and come up with more proactive solutions. But yeah, I agree with what Thomas says about not kind of going in with an agenda, because that is likely to be counterproductive, I think.
Yeah, then as you said, retuning focus, or being strong enough by nourishing your own being to go to where the people are. Well, now we are waiting for the people to come where we are. So that really is something that teachers could do. And you mentioned, Thomas, going to prison, that it could be a different system for prisons and other places that are now at the edge of society. Please, Richard, there you are.
Yeah.
You're still there. Please take the floor.
Yeah, I just put my hand down because I was aware of time, and I think my observation and possible question might be quite a big one. And I'm aware that we're supposed to be finishing at past, so I can hold on to it if you would prefer.
But time is a social construct, isn't it? So just take your moment.
Okay, thank you. I think that the most important thing that I would want to say is much gratitude to Ruth and Thomas for the work that you are doing. It really seems to me that mindfulness, what we're calling mindfulness, is really becoming fully fledged and fully bloomed now. I've been working in secular mindfulness for about 15 years and in the sort of mindfulness world for about 25 years. And the only reason I say that is I've had the good fortune to have a lot of teachers who have often pointed me to bringing awareness to what is missing as well as what is present. And one of the things that I've noticed, I guess I'm speaking on behalf of other people as well, is quite a lot of what has been missing in secular mindfulness. So the standardization of 8-week courses, the extracting of the social and ethical context that mindfulness originally came from, the lack of mention of interdependence, you know, has been quite striking in the field, in some of the clinical field anyway. So I guess my observation would be what we're talking about here today is nothing new. I mean, I celebrate it and I have a lot of gratitude, but it's not new. Thomas will know this. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh has been, you know, was around for years. There are plenty of people have been talking about that mindfulness is always relational. It's always engaged. If it's not relational and it's not engaged, it's not mindfulness. Yeah. I'm fortunate enough to, my local MP is Caroline Lucas, and I've spoken to her about this. Caroline Lucas is a very interesting politician because I think she understands that Parliament, certainly in the UK, parliamentary politics is extremely limited. A lot of these people who work in Parliament are inextricably connected to systems that are part of the problem and not part of the solution. And unfortunately, some of the politicians who are connected with mindfulness in the UK have a lot of kind of dirt on their hands for the policies that they support, the things that they do, and crucially, the things that they don't do and they don't say. So if there's a question in there, I mean, there's a concern in there, as you can probably hear, but I think there's a question, maybe to Ruth, about the report. And please remember that my initial point about I've a lot of gratitude and appreciation for what you're doing with the Mindfulness Initiative. All I would say is it's been a long time coming. What has taken us so long? But also, you know, a question there about that you're pitching a lot of your energy and a lot of your attention at people, politicians, political systems that one perspective is they are not capable of being able to deliver. And the real action, the real engagement needs to be elsewhere. This is what Caroline Lucas has been saying for years, you know. So I guess a question, so we're not getting too cozy and comfortable here, is, are you selling us short with your report?
Thank you. Great question and great observations. And yeah, I just want to say that I think Jamie and Christine and Rosen sort of intentionally didn't mention a lot of people in the report, but Thich Nhat Hanh did get mentioned and into being because it's so important and it's so fundamental. So completely recognise that what we're saying is not new and has been talked about by Ty and others for a very long time. And what we're trying to do in this report is give politicians like Caroline, who we've talked to a lot about this, the language to be able to do the advocacy on it and to talk about it. And this is just the start for us. So it's not here's the report, read it, we're done, you know, let's all go and feel cozy about it. It's really sort of getting into the detail of what needs to change. And, you know, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there in that part of the change that's needed is systems change. And actually, you know, we need to get into that on a much kind of deeper level and look at how we can use mindfulness and compassion to drive that and give us the language to drive it. So we are also meeting people where they are, and we see this as the beginning, not the end of that. Don't know whether that helps or answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thomas, would you want to react to what Richard said? Because it's not only the UK where this happens, it happens all over.
Yeah, very quickly, because I think an important point I've had, and I've made to, for example, Jamie in the Mindfulness Initiative. So, so this work is for good reason, is encoded into science. And we have to be aware that sometimes, because of the methodological constraints of how modern science works, we tend to, see other arguments about promoting mindfulness based on a very reductionist view of it, based on 8-week courses, etc. And this is very useful and part of the change we need to see. But maybe to take a little back what Richard has said, I think if we limit ourselves to this discussion, we are not really transforming, let's say, the conversation. And that's why, to me, I think we need to have a dialogue between wisdom and science because of the limitations of both. And I offer politics of being as an expression of that dialogue. And we should not limit ourselves to what science validates, because there are other resources that should be also legitimate when we can understand, the limitations of science.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, some people have already left us, and of course, yes, it's time. And this is not the end of this dialogue. This is not the end of the exchange. What consoles me is that we have shared how we already are implied in this. And Ruth and you, Thomas, and also you, Richard, explicitly mentioned mindfulness teachers are on this already, yet we can step up. We can step up into higher gear, making this not an individual thing, but making it a collective thing and becoming ambassadors of what you have put down in your book, Thomas, and what the Mindfulness Initiative has given us with the report. I think this is simply very inspiring to become a teacher, nourishing ourselves, to be of more service to the communities that we serve, and to go out, to go there, not stay on the cushion, but go there where they are. And I really invite you all to continue this dialogue. And quoting you, Ruth, why wouldn't we talk about it? Maybe translate it in your own language to have it available for your people, maybe make a summary, but why wouldn't we talk about it? Please, thank you for coming here, and please come back so we can continue this dialogue. It's not over yet. And I hope that also you will be inspired by active hope. Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Thanking everyone here for contributing, for listening, for holding the space, for going out and being the mindfulness teacher who can make that difference. See you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.